Never give up. Those are the immortal words of Winston Churchill during World War II. Looked impossible for the United States to win that World War, but he was the spokesman that led us. Never, never, never give up. And we won it. What immortal words that he left for us. There was an old country preacher once that was invited to a large, beautiful auditorium in the city to preach. He was scared to death. He slowly walked up to the pulpit and then grabbed onto the pulpit for dear life so he wouldn't fall. And he said, life is short, live it to the fullest. Love is rare, grab it and hold on to it. Anger is bad, dump it. Fear is awful, face it. Memories are sweet, cherish them. Heaven is real, go there. I just try to preach, but Jesus is the answer. And he sat down, and there was a standing ovation. That's really what it's all about. That's the sermon in a nutshell right there. The journey of life can be very, very difficult. These last 2 years, we've probably been stretched in some areas that we haven't been before. We've had so many funerals and so many losses, so many hurts. It's been a very, very difficult time. We're actually at a virtually zero population growth in the United States for the first time in a long, long time. You don't know it around here because we're growing so fast in this area. But you ask why, we're a zero population growth. And so we got a lot of things to face right now. I want to tell you a story that I don't think anybody here has ever heard, but it's an inspiring story. It'll help you not give up on your kids, help you not give up on your neighbors, help you not give up on your relatives. Most of you know that when I was 12 years old, I started preaching at a little black church in Childress, Texas every Sunday. And we lived next to his house, and that's the reason he asked me to preach. And so the biggest thing that happened that year is we got Marshall Keeble to come with his 6 or 8 little preacher boys. And Marshall Keeble could get the big crowds. He was probably the one person that could come to Childress and fill up anything that we had. So anyway, we worked with the little boys, and he just let me be like one of his little preacher boys, and we would hang up all the speakers for his sermons, and the white people, none of them came into where the seats were, but they would be in their cars for miles around. It'd be over 1,000 white people for his sermons. And it was just an incredible, incredible time together. And one of those little white preacher boys, black preacher boys, guess who it was? Oprah Winfrey's dad. Oprah Winfrey wasn't born yet, but he would become Oprah Winfrey. So we got pretty well acquainted, and I enjoyed him. He had a lot of vitality. He'd had a really rough life, was very poor. And when he got back to Nashville, shortly after that, he dropped out of college with Keeble, and a little over a year later, Oprah was having a baby. And not Oprah, but Oprah's mother was having a baby. And he named the baby Orpha from the book of Ruth. He thought that's what he wanted it to be, and he wrote out the birth papers for her name to be Orpha Winfrey. But he spelled it wrong, and so her name's always been Orpha. So it was quite a story. He and the mother didn't live together any time. They split. She went to live with who would have been her grandmother. And for the 6 months, that's where she was. She loved to talk to chickens. She always had a great sense of humor, and she loved to talk to the chickens. And then, when she's age 6, she moved to live with her mother. It was a terrible situation. There was a lot of bad things there, a bad neighborhood, and she lived there for the next 6 years. And then at age 12, she finally got to go home to Vernon, and that was the joy of her life. Now he had a barber's license in Nashville. That's where I met him a second time. He was a tremendous preacher. He's a Baptist preacher there. And he's preached every Sunday. And he had Oprah speak every Sunday. She was an incredible speaker. And you know, it's not long after this that she's the #1 speaker on national television. That's hard to believe. I mean, she was worth $2.5 billion, not million, $1 billion. She never gave up. Everything was against her. It seemed so difficult. And I know when we moved to Childress, the cattleman, some of you may remember this, had a lawsuit against Oprah. And she came and defended herself, and she continued to put on her TV show in Lubbock. And it was sort of funny. She came to the high school there, Amarillo High School, and picked out some students she wanted to be on her show. And Gina calls me and says that Oprah wants her to be on your show. And I said, Jana, why does Oprah want you on her show? She said, I was the best dancer. Now, how many of you remember the old days in Church of Christ of dancing? When it was a mortal sin. You remember that? Wow. I said, Jana, I didn't know you even knew how to dance. But anyway, she was the Oprah Winfrey show, and we got to meet her and knew her through the years. But it was a strange situation. But this last week, something happened. Vernon got sick and died. She died in her beloved arms of her son. And they had such a great closing after all of those years. 2 people with a tragic life, but they never gave up. And if there are those in this audience or those in this community that you know that think they can't make it, there's a lot of stories out there of people that have. Then the other person I want to talk to you about was a guy by the name of George Muller. George Muller is reputed to be, outside of Jesus, the greatest speaker that ever lived on the face of this earth. And yet most of our people have never heard of him. Just an incredible speaker. He was born over in Germany and Prussia to a wealthy family. His dad was a tax collector, and the son George would steal money from his dad. He also started buying beer with it and drinking and got addicted. And when his mother died when he was 14, they couldn't find him. He was off on a binge somewhere. And then he was arrested and put in jail for a couple of years, and his dad gave up on him. That's pretty bad. You know anybody in that kind of situation? You ever felt like giving up? But he never gave up. And he wrote about his conversion. When he got out of jail, a friend introduced him to a new preacher, a young preacher called a Plymouth Brethren preacher that was pretty popular over in the United States. And he fell in love with this guy and the message that he had, and he studied and studied. He went back to school and became a preacher, and then soon became the outstanding preacher in the world. His audiences would never have less than 5,000 in them. He talked to over 3 million people, and things were going great for him. And guess what happened on the power of this Word of God? Well, he was reading in his Bible that he'd read over 200 times on his knees, folks. George Muller read the Bible over 200 times on his knees. And he read, God is the father to the orphans. He said, that's what I want to be. And every day he would read the Bible on his knees, saying, God, help me help you be a father to the orphans. He built Christian orphanage. He built one in Bristol, England, that had 10,024 orphans. Now, my wife grew up at the Children's Home in Tipton. That's the biggest I know in Churches of Christ. It's probably one of the biggest of any religion. And they had about 300. That's a lot of orphans. Can you imagine 10,024? That's how many were in his orphanage. And then he also built 117 schools there in England. He offered Christian education to cover 120,000 children who were orphans. His passion was to help God's orphans. And that's what he did. He didn't ask for money much. He just told the people, he raised all that money for them. He just told all those people about, look at what God's doing with his orphans. Don't you want to bless them? And so the money just kept coming in. And he raised over $180 million, folks. Now, I'm going to share something I've never shared in my life. It's a dark secret that I don't think even Eric knows. But I have raised over $90 million for Churches of Christ and causes like Bread for a Hungry World and about 50 different churches throughout the world that we started from scratch and built them. John, you worked in the prison ministry where we had over 100,000 baptisms and Churches of Christ. There's a lot of things we've worked together, and they needed a lot of money. And I wouldn't have changed a thing. And that's what this guy said, George Muller. And so when he comes from age 70 to 93, he travels raising funds for his orphans all over the world. I don't know how you are about traveling. When you get beyond past 73, it loses a lot of luster for me. But that's what he did. And then he, at his funeral when he died in Bristol, England, they said he was the greatest speaker that ever lived. They said he was the happiest person that ever lived. They said he had the greatest faith of anybody who ever lived. And they said he was the greatest faith of anybody that ever lived. And he was one of the poorest people that ever lived. But that didn't make him any difference. And when his funeral came in Bristol, England, the lines were miles and miles and miles long for his funeral. Bristol was not a small town. It had a population of over 300,000 people. 300,000 people went by his casket and made a pledge to the family they would take care of his orphans. George Muller, one of the greatest examples of how the Bible changed his life. Life started out bad, terrible beginning, but what a change. And that's the power that God has over every one of us. So thank you for being here today. When you see those Bibles scattered all over the house, just look around at where they are, but never forget how powerful they are. And that message and that power on you and on your family is just incredible. So God bless you. Brent.